The wind reached Mercy Ridge before the train did. It came down off the brown hills in long, dry gusts, rattling the depot's sign on its chains, pushing grit under doors, into collars, into the corners of watching eyes. By the time the eastbound train groaned to a stop, half the town had already found a reason to be near the platform. A blacksmith who suddenly needed air. A woman with a basket of eggs who had somewhere else to be, except she wasn't going anywhere. A little girl who tugged her mother's sleeve and got pulled back instead of answered. They were waiting to see who stepped off. Emma Whittaker stepped off. She stood on the platform in a travel dress gone gray at the hem, 3 days of coal smoke ground into the wool, and felt the whole town measure her in a single glance. Not unkindly. Not kindly either. Just carefully, the way people look at weather that might turn. She had pictured this moment 100 times on the ride west. A man with his hat in his hands. A few careful words. The beginning of something plain and honest, because that was all the letter had promised, and she had not dared hope for more. I have a ranch, a clean name, and a need for a wife who is not afraid of quiet country. I cannot promise fine words, but I can promise a roof, honest work, and respect. Nathaniel Cross. No man came. Instead a boy walked toward her across the boards, maybe 12, his hat too big and his trousers too short, holding an envelope out like it might bite him. Miss Whittaker. I am. This was left for you. By Miss Hattie Bell. Not, he stopped himself, glanced back toward the town, and didn't finish the sentence. Emma took it. Her hands had gone stiff on the long ride, but that wasn't why they shook. Come to Bell House before asking questions in the street. Folks here talk faster than trains move. She looked up. The boy was already backing away. Where is Bell House? Yellow porch. He hesitated, and something crossed his face that looked almost like pity. You be careful, though. Careful of what? He didn't answer. He ran, boots kicking up dust, and left Emma alone on a platform that was already emptying behind her, the train exhaling its last steam and pulling east without her. For one long moment, she considered climbing back on. She let herself picture it, riding until the land turned familiar again, until the ache of this strange golden country faded into something safer. But safe was a room in her aunt's house that had run out of patience. Safe was hemming dresses by candlelight for women who paid late and smiled thin. Safe had already failed her once. She crossed the street instead, carpetbag pressed to her side, and before she could knock, the door of Bell House opened on its own. A small woman with silver hair and eyes like struck flint looked her over from collar to hem. You're Emma Whittaker. Yes, ma'am. I'm Hattie Bell. Come in before this town decides what to make of you. Inside smelled of coffee and starch and something sweeter underneath, cinnamon, maybe, or just the particular warmth of a house that expected people to arrive tired. A lantern burned low near the door though it was still afternoon, and that small unnecessary kindness nearly broke something loose in Emma's chest. Hattie poured coffee without asking if she wanted it. Nathaniel Cross isn't coming to fetch you, she said. Has something happened to him? Depends who you ask. Hattie's mouth was a flat line. He says he never sent for a bride. The room seemed to tilt very slightly. Emma set her cup down before her hand could betray her. That can't be right. She drew the letter from her glove, the paper gone soft at the folds from so much reading. This is his name. Hattie studied it a long moment. That's his name. It isn't his hand. They found him at the livery, tightening a girth on a tall bay horse, and Emma knew him before Hattie said a word. Broad through the shoulders, still as fenced timber, a faded scar through one dark brow. Not an old man, perhaps 35, but grief had left its own kind of weather on his face. A boy stood near the stall door, 6 or 7, clutching a wooden horse with one broken leg, watching Emma with open wonder. Nathaniel turned. His eyes went from Hattie, to Emma, to the carpet bag in her hand, and something guarded closed over his face like a door swinging shut. He took his hat off before he spoke. The gesture was slow. Reluctant. But it was respectful, and that respect made what came next land harder. "My name is Emma Whittaker," she said, and held out the letter. "You sent this?" "No, ma'am." His voice was quiet. "I did not." The stable had gone silent enough to hear the horses breathing. Every face in it had turned toward her, a hand stopped mid-brush over a mare's flank, a man near the door pretending badly not to listen. "Someone used my name without leave," Nathaniel said. The apology in his voice was decent, and somehow that made it worse. Emma had braced herself for a hard man, a cold cabin, a marriage built on need instead of affection. She had not braced herself for becoming a public mistake standing in the dust of a town that hadn't decided yet whether to pity her or laugh. "I am not asking charity from a man who doesn't want me," she said. Something shifted in his face at the word charity. Not anger. Something closer to pain. "I didn't mean it that way." "Then how did you mean it?" Neither of them had an answer ready. The little boy tugged at his father's sleeve, and Nathaniel took the letter fully into his hands for the first time, read it once, then again, slower. On the second reading, the color left his face. "What is it?" Hattie asked. He didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the last line, where his own name sat in a stranger's ink. "Where did you get this?" he asked Emma. "A marriage agency. In Cincinnati. A woman there, Mrs. Larkin." Hattie drew a short breath through her nose. Nathaniel heard it. Emma watched him hear it. Outside, a gust of wind pushed dust through the open stable door, curling around her boots like smoke that hadn't decided where to go yet. Nathaniel looked toward the street, then back at her, and his voice dropped into something lower, weighted with a thing he clearly didn't want to say. "Miss Whittaker. You should stay at Bell House tonight. Lock your door." "Why?" His eyes flicked to the boy, then away. "Because whoever sent you here didn't do it for your happiness." He set his hat back on. Not before she saw the worry underneath it. "And before morning," he said, "they may know you've arrived." Sleep did not come easily that night. Bell House was kinder than any place she'd slept on the long road west, but kindness couldn't quiet a mind that kept turning the same question over like a coin: who writes a lie and signs another man's name to it? Emma sat on the edge of the narrow bed long after the town had gone dark, the false letter open on the quilt beside her, tracing Nathaniel's signature without touching the ink, as if the answer might rise up out of the paper if she looked long enough. Across the street, one lantern still burned in the livery. A shape moved past the open door. She knew him by the set of his shoulders before she could see his face. He stopped. Turned toward Bell House, as if he could feel her watching. She stepped back from the window before he could catch her at it. She was angry with him. She had every right to be. And yet she couldn't forget the way he'd removed his hat before speaking to a woman he had every reason to resent, or the way his hand had rested on his son's shoulder, gentle as something learned rather than performed. "Men show their nature in small movements," her mother used to say. "And men also know how to perform gentleness when it serves them." Emma didn't know yet which kind of man Nathaniel Cross was. She only knew she meant to find out. Morning brought coffee, cold water, and Beatrice Vale. She arrived on the boarding house steps in a plum-colored gown, white gloves folded over the porch rail, smiling like a woman unveiling a gift rather than a woman who had just been caught. Nathaniel went rigid at the sight of her. "You had no right," he said. "Only what someone should have done long ago," Beatrice answered sweetly, and turned to Emma with the practiced warmth of a woman used to being believed. "I brought your bride home." It took the better part of a bitter, public hour to learn the shape of it. Beatrice, Nathaniel's late wife's sister, keeper of the dress shop, keeper of opinions about what a grieving man owed his son, had written to the agency herself, describing Nathaniel, describing the ranch, setting the whole quiet disaster in motion out of something that might have been love for a lonely boy, or might have simply been the itch of a woman who could not leave other people's houses in order. But even she went pale when Nathaniel held up the final letter, the one that had crossed a continent in his name. "I wrote the first letter," she admitted. "Not that one." It was a small, cracked window into a room none of them could yet see into. Someone else had finished what Beatrice started. Someone had taken her clumsy meddling and sharpened it into something else entirely. Before anyone could press further, a voice spoke from the shadow of the livery door. "Did you send for her, Aunt B?" Daniel, for that was his name, Emma learned, spoken now with a weight she hadn't expected, stood holding his broken wooden horse against his chest, fear and hurt both plain on his small face. "You said if a new lady came, Pa would stop being sad." Beatrice closed her eyes. And Emma, standing in the street with a stranger's lie in her hand and a whole town watching to see what she'd do with it, understood for the first time that this was not only a woman's plan gone wrong. There was a child inside it. A child who had been listening at doors, carrying words too heavy for him. "I am not a hammer for your broken things," Emma told Beatrice, and meant it down to the bone. That should have been the worst of the day. It was not. By afternoon, a drummer at Bell House mentioned, too casually, pretending innocence and failing, that a man had been asking after her at the depot. Gray suit. City boots too clean for these streets. A scar near his mouth. She knew that scar. She had swept its origin off a kitchen floor in Cincinnati, a shattered china plate, a man's soft laugh as he pressed a handkerchief to a bleeding lip and told her she was too jumpy to keep good employment. Victor Harrow. Attorney. The man who had told her, 3 days after her employer died still owing her wages, that missing pay was a family matter and not a legal one. He had followed her 1,400 miles. She did not have time to wonder why before she saw him, a gray shape stepping out of the depot office at the far end of the street, pausing, turning his head as if he'd caught a scent. He smiled. Nathaniel moved before anyone else did. He didn't grab her arm or order her inside. He simply stepped beside her, took his hat off one more time, and said, low enough for only her to hear. "You don't have to face him alone." Emma looked at the man from Ohio walking toward her through the dust of a town that had, in 2 short days, become far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined a quiet ranch could be. "I won't run in daylight," she said. Victor's questions in the street that afternoon were carefully aimed, not accusations, not yet, only the shape of a threat wearing a lawyer's manners. Missing papers from a dead man's estate. Papers he seemed certain Emma had carried west with her. A day's grace before he brought the sheriff into it properly. He left a taste in the air like cold iron. That night, Nathaniel would not let her stay in town. Cross Ranch sat 2 hours out under a long orange sky, a leaning fence, a windmill with one bent blade, a plain log house with a blue shawl folded over a porch rocking chair that no one, Emma understood without asking, had touched in a long while. Inside, over cornbread and lamplight, she mended Daniel's broken wooden horse with wax thread and a scrap of leather while the boy watched her the way children watch things they are deciding whether to trust. "Did your ma teach you that?" he asked. "Some. Work taught me the rest." "Where's your ma?" Emma's hands went still over the thread. "Gone to heaven, I hope." Daniel nodded with the grave, quiet wisdom of a child who already understood that loss wasn't only for old people. Later, when the house had gone dark and Nathaniel checked the latch on every window twice, Emma sat by the dying fire with a cracked porcelain teacup in her hands, the only fine thing in the whole plain house, painted with small violets, a spiderweb crack mended carefully down one side. "Whose was this?" she asked. "Abigail's." His voice was rough around the name. "Dropped it a week before she died. I fixed it badly. She kept using it anyway." Emma turned it gently in the firelight, and something caught the corner of her eye, two small letters painted in faded blue beneath the base, half hidden by the curve of the porcelain. She tilted the cup toward the flame to see them clearly. Her breath stopped in her chest. "E.W. Nathaniel." Her voice came out strange even to her own ears. He crossed the room in 2 steps. "What is it?" She held the cup out, her finger resting just beneath the tiny painted letters, and watched his face change as he understood what she already had. Those were not Abigail's initials. They were Emma's. And somehow, long before any false letter ever carried her west, something bearing her name had already been waiting inside this house. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The fire cracked low in the hearth, and outside the wind pushed dry grass against the log walls, patient as something waiting to be let in. "That doesn't make sense," Nathaniel said finally, but his voice had lost its certainty. "No," Emma agreed. "It doesn't. Which means somewhere in this there's a piece neither of us has found yet." He set the cup down on the mantel with the care of a man handling something that might still be alive. Sleep, when it came, was thin and restless. Near midnight Emma heard him shift on his pallet by the door, awake, same as her. "You ever hear your wife mention a woman named Whitaker?" she asked into the dark. "Or a man named Edmund Whitcomb?" "No." A pause. "There was a trunk, though. Came through a church sale years back, out of the old stage office. Blue, brass corners. Abigail bought the teacup out of it." "Who bought the trunk?" His silence answered before he did. "Beatrice." They rode into town at first light, Daniel wedged between them on the wagon seat too stubborn to be left behind, and found Beatrice's dress shop smelling of lavender and fear the moment the bell over the door stopped ringing. She went the color of old linen when she saw the teacup wrapped in cloth in Emma's basket. "There's a hidden drawer," she admitted, voice cracking. "Letters. A bank draft. My father's hand." Her eyes filled. "I never told George the first opened it." "You told him about the trunk, though," Nathaniel said. "It wasn't a question." "Last night. After Mr. Harrow came asking." Beatrice pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. "George must not know I've told you any of this." The bell rang again. George Vale stepped through the door, smiling like a man walking into his own parlor, and turned the lock behind him with a click that seemed to swallow all the air in the shop. What followed was not shouting. George didn't need to shout. He had spent years learning that money could do a man's raising of his voice for him, and he used that same smooth, patient cruelty now, first on his wife, reminding her whose management kept silk on her shelves, then on Nathaniel, reminding him whose signature sat on a note that came due in 6 weeks. But grief has a way of teaching people what they will and won't survive twice. You forged Nathaniel's name, Beatrice said, and her voice, for the first time in the whole ugly business, did not shake. George's mask slipped, just slightly. I completed an arrangement your carelessness began. You told Victor Harrow where to find her. I answered a fair question honestly. You knew about the water rights before you ever offered Nathaniel that loan. This came from Emma, quiet and certain, and George's eyes cut toward her with something colder than annoyance now. That's why the terms were so hungry. You weren't lending him money. You were buying time until he lost the land on his own. Outside, Hattie Bell's voice rang through the locked door like a struck bell of her own. Beatrice, why is this door shut? And within minutes half of Mercy Ridge had gathered on the boardwalk to watch George Vale's polish crack in front of a shop full of witnesses. He left threatening a noon meeting at the sheriff's office. Everyone understood it wasn't really a threat anymore. It was a man trying to reach the truth before the truth reached him. At noon, the sheriff's office held more truth than its 4 walls seemed built to carry. Victor Harrow sat stiff behind a desk that wasn't his. George stood near the window with his gloves in his hands. Sheriff Amos Pike listened, wrote, and asked the kind of plain questions that made both men shift in their chairs. Emma told it all, Edmund Whitcomb's failing hands, the sealed envelope he'd pressed into her keeping 2 nights before he died, the nephew who'd searched drawers before the old man was cold, the coat stolen from a St. Louis depot with that envelope sewn into its lining. Victor called it convenient. Emma called it survival. Neither of them was entirely wrong, and the sheriff seemed to understand that better than either man wanted him to. Then the schoolteacher, Lydia Park, arrived at Hattie's urging with a memory from childhood, a shipping tag once tucked under the strap of a blue trunk, reading a name she'd never forgotten because she'd wanted the trunk for her dolls. Whitaker. Mercy Ridge to Cincinnati. Emma's legs went weak enough that Nathaniel's hand found her elbow without either of them deciding it should. And when a deputy arrived carrying a mud-stained blue coat found in a St. Louis freight crate, hers, torn at the sleeve but unmistakably hers, the sheriff opened the hem with a careful knife and drew out an oilcloth packet that had waited 4 years to be found. For Emma Whitaker, rightful heir to the Bellamy grazing claim and the South water rights of Mercy Ridge. The room went very still. It came out slowly after that, the way old wounds do, that Beatrice's father, Walter Bellamy, had a second daughter no one spoke of. That Eliza Bellamy became Eliza Whitaker and raised a girl who grew up with sad eyes, strong hands, and one chipped blue teacup she cried over the day it finally broke. That Edmund Whitcomb had spent his last years trying, badly, to make an old friend's wrong right, and that George Vale had known the shape of that secret long before anyone else in the room, because a railroad survey crew had recently marked a spur line straight through Cross Ranch's water, and water, suddenly, was worth more than grief. You knew, Beatrice said to her husband, and something in her voice broke open for good. All these years, you knew my father had another daughter, and you let me believe I was alone in the world. George didn't deny it. He simply stopped pretending, which was worse. The papers went into Sheriff Pike's safe to wait for circuit court. Victor and George left in opposite directions down the street, 2 men who had briefly held opposite ends of the same rope and now, watching each other go, seemed to understand neither had really been holding it at all. It should have ended there. It didn't. That evening, back at Cross Ranch, Nathaniel stood beside Emma on the porch as the sun dropped gold and heavy over the south meadow. This land may be yours, he said. Enough of it to change things. I didn't come to take your home. I know. Sadness moved behind his eyes. But the papers say what they say. He was already, gently, giving her a door to walk through, telling her she'd have better choices now than a tired ranch and a man with more sorrow than savings. She was about to tell him exactly what she thought of that when a gunshot cracked from the direction of the barn. Nathaniel had the rifle off its pegs before Emma finished flinching. A riderless black horse, Victor's, burst screaming into the yard, a broken rein dragging behind it. Another shot struck the windmill blade with a shriek of bent metal. Daniel, inside, Nathaniel barked, and Emma was already moving, pulling the boy down behind the hearth, pressing his small shaking body close while smoke began threading in from somewhere near the hay shed. It was Victor, crawling out from behind the barn with blood dark at his ribs and no polish left on him at all, who told them the rest. George had shot him over a disagreement about whether burned evidence stayed burned. George had ridden for town to reach the letters in his own safe before daylight made liars of him. George meant to destroy in an hour what 4 years of silence had failed to bury. Nathaniel and Emma fought the shed fire together first, bucket after bucket, her arms screaming, sparks catching in her hair, because a burning barn was a danger no truth could wait out. Only after, with Victor bound to the porch post and Daniel wrapped in his mother's blue shawl and made to promise he'd stay with Hattie, did they ride hard for Mercy Ridge under a rising moon, a stolen brass key clenched in Nathaniel's fist. They found George behind the Vale house with a satchel in one hand and a lantern in the other, the shed beside him already burning, panic showing plain on a face built for hiding things. "Put it down," Nathaniel said. George didn't. He might have run for it, might have talked his way past them the way he'd talked his way past every hard truth in his life, until Beatrice stepped out into the yard in her nightdress, hair loose, and said one word that seemed to cost her everything and give her everything back at once. "No." He turned on her with all his old contempt. She didn't flinch this time. "I have regretted obeying you for years," she told him. The shed wall gave way in a shower of sparks between George and the alley he'd meant to run through, and by the time Sheriff Pike's deputy had him by the arm, the satchel had already landed at Emma's feet, letters, a ledger, the original loan note, and a map with the water rights circled in George's own careful hand. It was Daniel, climbing down from Hattie's wagon despite every protest, who finished what none of the adults quite managed. He walked straight up to the aunt who'd just been told by her own husband that she was nothing, and told her otherwise. "You made Mama's dresses," he said. "And you bring peppermint when I'm sad. You ain't nothing." Beatrice knelt and held him and wept into his hair, and for the first time since Emma had arrived in Mercy Ridge, nobody in the yard was performing anything at all. Later, with the fire out and the town's whispering finally aimed somewhere other than at her, Emma stood apart, soot on her sleeve, her hands still shaking from more than smoke. Nathaniel found her there. "I thought that wall would fall on me," he said quietly. "And I thought, I'd leave Daniel without a father, and leave you thinking you'd brought ruin to my door instead of the truth. That's what frightened you most. Not dying. Leaving the people I love with the wrong story." The words settled between them, plain and unshowy, exactly the way he said everything that mattered. "I loved Abigail," he said. "I'll always honor that. For a long time I thought honoring it meant keeping the rest of my heart buried with her. Then you stepped off a train with dust on your dress and more courage than sense, and my house started breathing again." Emma thought of everything the last 2 days had cost her and given her in nearly equal measure, a lie that had carried her 1,400 miles, a name she hadn't known was waiting for her, a boy who trusted her with a broken horse before he trusted her with anything else. "I came here because a letter promised me respect," she said. "You gave it to me without knowing whether I'd stay. That's worth more than anything that letter said." "Then stay," he said. Not a question. Not quite a plea either. Just the truth, offered plain, the way he offered everything. I choose to stay, Emma said. Not because I've nowhere else to go. Because I want this, you, and Daniel, and that stubborn windmill, and whatever we build honest, starting now. He kissed her there in the ash and moonlight, and it tasted like smoke and like the beginning of something that hadn't needed a lie to happen after all, only the truth, finally, given room to breathe. By spring, the water rights were confirmed under Emma's name. George Vale's fraud unraveled his loan along with most of his fine reputation, and Victor Harrow traded a prison cell for a witness chair, testifying against the nephew who'd sent him chasing a servant girl across 3 territories for a truth that was never his to hide. Beatrice kept her shop. She gave Emma the old blue trunk, empty now except for one thing she'd saved and never told anyone about, a small violet saucer that matched a cracked teacup down to the last painted petal. The wedding was small and unhurried. Daniel carried the rings tucked in the hollow back of a wooden horse with a gold-painted leg, because, as he informed everyone solemnly, standing deserves some shine. Hattie Bell cried and denied it loudly enough that 3 people believed her. That night, Nathaniel pulled the cloth from Abigail's piano for the first time in 4 years. Beatrice played the song his wife used to sing, and Daniel, shy at first, found the words he still remembered and sang along. On the porch, the lantern burned steady against the blue dusk, no longer a light left waiting for someone who wasn't coming home, but a light kept for whoever still needed to find their way there. Years later, when people in Mercy Ridge asked Emma Cross how she'd ever ended up in a town that had once looked at her like trouble walking off a train, she'd smile across a crowded supper table at her husband and say the same thing every time. I arrived because of a letter that lied. I stayed because of a man who never did.